Lowering risk in meetings, trainings, and in conversations. Got a little birthday card there at the end on squeezing that last sentence in. So I've been a facilitator for over 10 years now. And I started by doing gender and sexuality workshops and kind of then more broadly social justice workshops for the first decade plus of my career. I've kind of always been doing social justice conversations. And in those conversations, there is always a high degree of social risk. And when I say social risk, basically like I'm not doing facilitation that's on ropes courses that where we're, on zip lines up in the trees. Like there isn't a physical risk, but there is a social emotional risk that is present in a lot of the conversations that I have had and a lot of the trainings and the workshops that I have helped lead and that I have facilitated. And so over the years, I've learned a lot about how we can mitigate those social risks, how we can lower the vulnerability and the feeling of like emotional exposure for people. And I've also seen people do it really poorly. So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about some of the things that I think that are commonplace habits that don't work to lower that social emotional risk. Let's go ahead and let's jump into kind of like why these things come up. When we have a tricky conversation coming up, whether it's that we're facilitating something that is vulnerable or challenging or personal or heated, whether it's you're having a feedback session with your team about things that aren't working, or that something has happened in the office or in your community that is just like needing to be talked about, but isn't going to be easy to talk about. Those situations happen often. And a lot of times they are actively avoided or kind of like people will not give them the like container and the time they need in order to actually be successful. So I think there's a few kind of key questions that we should ask ourselves when we're going into having a tricky conversation. One question, how are we going to have this conversation? Not do we need to, but once you've answered the do we need to question, the next question is how. How are we going to have this conversation? What are the structures and the strategies and the frameworks that we're going to use to guide us through this experience? You can just kind of like say, we all need to talk about this. But from my experience and probably from your experience, that doesn't lead to the best outcome. So the question of how are we going to have that tricky conversation is a really crucial one to begin with. Question 2 that I think is really important is what vulnerability is required and kind of necessary for this to happen, and in what ways can we lower that experience of vulnerability and kind of lower the risk for that vulnerability. There are, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, but there are a lot of times I see vulnerability being done for the sake of vulnerability. And a lot of times in these tricky conversations, we need people to take risk. We need people to be courageous and be vulnerable and open. But I think we also need to think about what are the ways we need that, and then what are all the different forms we can invite people to do that in, right? Do they need to say it out loud? Do they need to say it where we can attach it to them personally? Do they even have to express it to the entire group? There's a lot of kind of different like layers to, we know we need that information, but what are the different ways we can elicit that information to bring it into the group's consciousness? So I think that's a really important question too, is what vulnerability is absolutely necessary? And then what can we do in order to structure that vulnerability that lowers the risk? Question 3, what are we going to do with this information after we get it? I think this might be one of the most important questions to ask ourselves when we get into a tricky conversation or when we are kind of setting ourselves up to have a tricky conversation, run a really vulnerable meeting, training, or workshop, is what are we going to do afterward? Because a lot of times I have seen people ask for people to give real feedback, to get vulnerable, to get real with each other, and then that information goes nowhere. And what that does is that it makes people feel really disillusioned with the process. They're like, why did I have to put myself out there if nothing is going to come of it? It leads to resentment. And it also really tanks our ability to do that in the future. If we ask people to be vulnerable and then we do nothing with the information, the likelihood that they're going to be willing to be vulnerable again decreases dramatically. So it's really important for us, even if it's not articulated to the group, but it's important for any of the leaders or the organizers to know, what am I asking for? And then what am I going to do with that information once I have it? And, in the case of trainings and workshops, it might also be, what do I want them to do once they have that information? Specific calls to action, specific next steps, or just knowing that you have that answer, even if it's not articulated to the group, so that you can make sure that you're asking for that vulnerability for a reason. And the last thing I want to acknowledge before we get into some of those bad habits that I see people do. So the last thing I think that's important to ask ourselves, and to really recognize and reckon with these kind of hot button, tricky conversations, is to understand that vulnerability is more complicated when it's at work. So, I see a lot of conversations happen about like, how can we give each other real feedback? How can we be open and honest with our colleagues? And something that I think we need to acknowledge continuously when we enter these conversations is that it is a vulnerability at work is a unique and particularly tricky thing to do, because people's livelihoods are attached to their work. And I know we know this on an intellectual level, but I think it can be easy to just not want to navigate the kind of fullness of that situation on a practical level. That asking people to be real with the people who can fire them, the people who can hire them, the people that can give them recommendations in the future is a particularly kind of high bar to ask people to clear. So I think that's one of the reasons I am really cautious, maybe too strong a word, but I want to be very thoughtful in the ways that I'm inviting people to be vulnerable in front of colleagues, superiors, people they supervise, because that dynamic, when you leave the room, I don't have to deal with it if I'm not employed at that company, but they have to continue to deal with the knock-on effects and the consequences of those actions, right? So I think it's really important for anybody who is organizing an event where they're going to be asking people to take make vulnerable moves or take risks in front of their colleagues and coworkers, or just their peers, their network, at a conference or something like that, to really deal with the kind of gravity of what it means to ask people to do that in front of people who affect their livelihoods and their careers. So just wanted to acknowledge that I think that that's an underlying truth that we have to actively navigate and include when we're deciding what is appropriate and what is not just appropriate, but what people are going to be willing to kind of meet us, right? If we're asking people, can you be this vulnerable? Is it reasonable to ask people to do that in these types of settings? It's always there's so often that it's necessary, but also we have to be conscious of that kind of trade-off and that, that trade-off that people have. So those are just some of the things that are kind of underlying some of my thoughts as we go into this larger conversation. When people are leading meetings, trainings, workshops, conversations, where people are going to be taking risk, being vulnerable, answering tricky topics, getting into heated conversations, there are a few things that I see people do that in an effort to lower that risk, to navigate that vulnerability. And some of those things I think are misguided or just don't have the intended effect that we want them to have. The first thing that I see people do to try to navigate vulnerability and lower risk in their sessions is they set ground rules. Now, there's kind of two ways to set ground rules that I think have different levels of impact and different levels of success, basically, when you're when you're doing this. And I'm going to say this isn't going to be all the times. I'm sure that somebody really successfully does the thing that I'm about to say doesn't work. And if you're that person, jump into the comments and let me know that you're wrong. It works for me. This is why. And I'm sure that that's true. But on the whole, for the sessions that I've gone to, ground rules are kind of overemphasized, underutilized, and can often lead to this false sense of security that people have, that this is a space where they can show up, be vulnerable, be open, and be safe to do so. They kind of are there on paper, but not in effect. There are two big ways to do ground rules. One is kind of facilitator created ground rules. You come in with the ground rules already written up and you ask the group basically for their buy-in or agreement to go with these. And then the other is kind of group created ground rules or group norms. I've done both of these in my career, and I think they have very different effects. And they also kind of had very different manifestations in our sessions. So let's just talk about the group created ones to begin. I think that if you're with a group for a long time and you want to see where the group is, what they want, what they're hoping for with each other, then there's probably a time and place for group created ground rules. But when it comes to one-off meetings or just like short meetings, trainings, workshops, conversations, I think that this can lead to a lot of general statements that aren't particularly helpful. So what I mean by that is like you say, okay, what are some group norms we want to have for this conversation? And someone raises their hand and is like, respect. And you're like, okay, respect. Yeah. What does that mean to you? And you end up spending a ton of time unpacking basically like how to be good people to each other, often in really broad terms, in really buzzwordy phrases. And I have found that it often doesn't lead to substantial group change. And it also is more like, in theory, these things would be nice, but in practice, we don't know what it looks like. And so we don't know how to actually execute that in the meeting. So personally, I think that if you're going to do group norms, if you're going to do ground rules, it's good for you to go in with the ones that you think are necessary for this conversation and to kind of either get group buy-in or just let them know how these are going to be actioned in the setting, right? So one thing that I used to do is I had a list of group norms, and I would just ask people to read the kind of the 5 or 6 words that were kind of like the bold summary of that group norm, and then I would ask them, what does that mean to you? And those people would kind of iterate on, one of them was be as present as you can be. That means phones too. And people would say, well, I think we should try to be present and listen to each other, and phones can really detract from that. And I'd be like, great, okay, next one. And we would move to the next one. Minds are like parachutes. They only work when they're open. What does that mean to you? And it would take about 5 minutes. There were specific reasons I had for each one, and I would let the group really give their voice to it, but I would let the group give their voice to it, but I would start and give us a framework to begin with, right? So I think that can be helpful. And I think for new facilitators, for people who are nervous or they want to make very explicit some expectations of the meeting, I think group norms and ground rules have a place. I also think, though, that they are over-relied upon to actually do the work that we have to do as facilitators. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when we are facilitating a session, if we say, respect everyone's time, or step up, step back, this idea of if you're, oversharing, be conscious of that. And if you haven't shared, really lean into doing so. That idea as a group norm, I have seen presented many, many times, but then it doesn't get enforced or curated by the facilitator themselves. They don't cut people off and they don't explicitly bring people in. And just saying a group norm is not enough to actually make a group norm happen. So that's where I think there's an over-reliance on group norms to actually do the work that we have to model and regulate as facilitators. So that's why I put group norms in my wrong answers for how to lower risk. Isn't because they can't be effective, but because I think they are over relied upon to be effective. And sometimes they tend to leave people with this false sense, the facilitator in particular, this false sense of cool, well, I said it, now it's up to the group to regulate themselves. So those are just some things to be aware of with group norms. Other things I see people do to lower risk. I would say this one that I want to talk about isn't something I see people to do to lower risk, but I think it is a really destructive thing that I see people do in relationship to vulnerability. So have you ever been in a session or a workshop where people are using vulnerability in order to create this kind of fake sense of intimacy or gravitas with their session? They're asking people to do things that feel really vulnerable so that they can all have this vulnerable shared experience. I think that can be really damaging. I think that doing that is really playing with vulnerability and people's emotions in a way that I think is kind of like unethical and emotionally irresponsible. So I think it's important that when we are asking people to be vulnerable, that we have a reason for them to do that. And it's not so they can understand the gravity of the situation, because as soon as they're feeling it in their bodies, there's going to be a lot of regulation that needs to happen in the rest of the session, right? One time I was at a conference and the keynote speaker had a section where they just listed a bunch of questions up on PowerPoints and then played one after the other. And what they would ask is for people to stand up or sit down if that thing applied to them. And it started off as something that's really simple, like I'm I went to college, and then we kind of maybe upgraded to like, I'm the first in my family to go to college. We're already starting to get into social risk, right? Because that is revealing of class status, that is revealing of maybe something that was difficult or like a challenge to people, an oppression they experienced. Like that's already getting at something that is like kind of socially complicated, but also, to be celebrated. But then they started getting into really personal questions. And one of those questions was, have you or has anyone that you know ever dealt with suicidal ideation? And I saw people stand up for this, which I thought was incredibly vulnerable and brave of them to do, and sit back down. And then the facilitator, the presenter, did nothing with that information. It was just there. It was just asked for and then done nothing with. And that's what I mean by using vulnerability to kind of like create this experience of gravitas and importance. I think that is a really irresponsible thing for us to do as leaders. And I think if we're asking for vulnerability, there has to be something that we're doing with it. So I think that is something that I see people do around this question of vulnerability and risk that I think is really irresponsible. And I just want to name that I think we need to have intention behind it. And we need, when we're asking for those big moments of vulnerability, there has to be a point. Let's talk about the things that you can do to lower risk in conversations, meetings, or trainings that you're leading. There are a lot of different options that we have to lower risk, to navigate and kind of appropriately contain people's vulnerability, to like create containers for their vulnerability, and to make the experience of having a difficult conversation, a tricky meeting, or navigating a really hot or political topic in a workshop easier, right? Our jobs as facilitators, as leaders in these environments is to make it easier for us to get through it. It's not to help people avoid the conversation. It's not to make sure that no one, has an uncomfortable experience in it, but it is to make the experience of what we're trying to do easier. So I spent the first, 10 years of my career doing social justice work. So for me, it was, how can we learn about a topic that is socially, controversial, taboo to some extent? How can we learn about this topic and not feel like destructively uncomfortable? How can we have like tolerance for discomfort, and how can I make it easier for people to ask questions, to learn about something that is difficult, and to, be self-introspective? How can I make that easier throughout the process? If you're in a conversation with a bunch of colleagues and you're trying to make a difficult decision, or you're trying to address something that came up in your community that is like really difficult and bothering people, your job is to make that easier. And there's a lot of like kind of big picture things we can do. And I want to share a bunch of frameworks and kind of specific strategies that you can use when you're needing to get into those difficult moments with a group. Okay, so the first thing that I think is important to do is to take social risk seriously. It is to understand that as social creatures, putting ourselves out there and having people judge us is something that is incredibly risky for us to do. It is like we care a lot about what people think of us, regardless if we should or shouldn't. We do. And especially when it's attached to our livelihoods at work, it is something that we really need to take seriously. So that's why I'm dedicating this whole conversation to this idea of how do we navigate social risk. Is first we have to take it seriously, and then we have to actually program and set ourselves up for it in intentional ways. Okay? So the Other thing that I think is really important that I've mentioned earlier in the series is that only asking for vulnerability that you're going to do something with. If you're asking people to be vulnerable, there needs to be a plan of what to do with that information, both in the session and ideally what to do after the session. The last thing I want to talk about is that we want to set reasonable and specific expectations of behavior, and then we want to enforce that throughout the session. So if we say, I want to make sure we hear from everybody, we have to use structures and frameworks that are actually going to let us hear from everybody. If we want to say, like, there are particular voices that I want to make sure get at the, majority of the airtime in this conversation because those are the people who raise the concerns, or those are the people who have been most specifically impacted by this action, then actually creating structures and ways to make that happen is really important. So the idea of group norms and ground rules, which we talked about a little bit earlier, I think can be over-relied on, but if we actually make any of those group norms or we set these expectations, we need to have ways that we're setting ourselves up and the group up for success in actually meeting those expectations. So let's get into, let's talk about a little bit what I mean by kind of like structures and frameworks for this conversation, for tricky conversations, for conversations where we're asking people to be vulnerable, to take emotional risk. What do I mean by structures and frameworks? So for those of you who might be new to the channel or just unfamiliar, we make this deck called facilitator cards. And facilitator cards are a deck of frameworks and tools and kind of processes that you can use to run meetings, trainings, conversations, your whole business in life, if you're like us. But they're basically a set of structures and processes, ways of thinking through particular questions. So rather than asking, how's everybody doing? And just putting that question out to the large group as just a popcorn share, like whoever goes, I'd be up for hearing from anybody. There are 15 different ways to surface emotions in the deck of facilitator cards. And why I want to explain that is that, to me, thinking about our invitations for participation as structures allows us to be far more intentional about the actions that we're taking as facilitators. A lot of times when I talk to facilitators, people who run meetings, who are not necessarily like professional facilitators who have been doing this for years, but they're new to the field, or they're managers, they're, leading a nonprofit. They aren't people who spend their days thinking and trying to solve the problems of facilitation. They are thinking about their jobs and their coworkers and their role and, what they're trying to accomplish in their work. And so when they get into a meeting or they are leading a training, they are often like, well, I'm going to present some information and then I'm going to have a conversation. And for me, the have a conversation, there are like 101 ways to have a conversation. And those structures, the ways we have conversations, the ways we invite people to participate, the way that we brainstorm, that we get into the nitty-gritty details of a topic, that we make decisions, that we surface what's going on emotionally for the group, all of those things, the ways we do that, we have a lot of choice in the structures and the frameworks that we use to invite a group to do those different types of actions. So what's awesome about frameworks is that we can use specific frameworks to have tricky conversations and to make those things go more smoothly. It's not going to remove all of the vulnerability. It's not going to remove all the discomfort, but it's more going to create appropriate containers for that vulnerability, for that discomfort to occur in, that can allow people to be more expressive, that can allow people to tolerate actually getting through that conversation without having to check out, without having to distract themselves on their phone. And ideally, it's going to allow us to have that experience as a group, right? A lot of times what we're doing is we're having when we bring people together to have a meeting, a training, a workshop, a conversation, we need to get on the same page and have a shared experience. And so in order for that to happen, we need people to be present, like both physically, but also like spiritually, emotionally, intellectually present. And we will check out if it becomes too overwhelming for our system. So I think structures and frameworks can really help us do that.